Good afternoon and good morning to all of you. Thank you for joining the ABA and ACRAA's joint webinar on key trends in sustainable finance and climate transition assessment. My name is Andy Chang, Senior Director of Taiwan Ratings Corporation. It's my great honor to conduct the opening and introduction. To achieve the net zero target by 2050 and sustainable goals, transition finance and sustainable finance are getting more and more important to all banks around the world. How to make good use of the climate transition assessment to achieve a lower carbon and climate resilient future for entities and to avoid greenwashing. Let's listen to the two insightful speakers. The first speaker is ACRAA's chairman, Mr. Atsushi Masuda. He plays various important roles at Japan Credit Rating Agency, including Counselor for International Affairs, Chief Analyst for International Ratings Department, and Chief Sustainable Finance Analyst for Sustainable Finance Evaluation Group. Mr. Masuda will talk about the transition finance in Japan. The second speaker is Joyee Lam, Associate at S&P Global Rating's Sustainable Finance team. Based in Hong Kong, Joyee has been with the team for over 3 years and has led multiple second-party opinions across APAC, Europe, and the Middle East regions. She will share with us on the key trends in sustainable finance and transition financing. Now, I shall hand it over to Mr. Masuda for him to make his presentation.
Today, I'm going to talking about sustainable finance, in particular, transition finance. And we have completed more than 30 the evaluation of the sustainable transition financing. And Japanese government is particularly focused upon this transition finance because it's a quite flexible instrument to tailor with the for high emission sector. So this is the background of this talk. Today, I have 3 subjects. One is how can we evaluate of those transition finance. And second one is a case study, particularly for energy sector. And the third one, and Japanese government is the first government which issues sovereign transition bonds. And we are providing to the second party opinion to this the sovereign transition bonds. And I'm going to touch very briefly about our evaluation of those sovereign transition bonds. First, evaluation framework of Japan credit rating agencies. We are #1 second opinion providers in Japan, sustainable financing arena. And so we are quite active to making a sustainable financing evaluation. And also we directly participate to the government council to set up certain standards and also maybe principles set by Japanese government. So that is our prime functions and our contribution to the development of markets in the Japanese market, Japan. In the year 2019, ICMA proposed to establish global rule for transition financing. After that, government level and also that the ICMA level formulate a working group and setting up certain international standards. And that's defining what is the scope and eligibility for those under transition financing. And it's almost under 5 years of this one. And now transition finance is one of the main instruments of the sustainable finance. Particularly that transition finance can deal with high emission sector. I'm going to explain of this one. Transition finance, not just only to the directly eligible item like green finance of those and the solar panel or wind farm. And this finance should be addressed with the high emission sector, which certain condition is necessary. Prerequisite element is long-term strategy of individual companies. And this strategy should be credible and also science-based. This target should be consistent with the target set by Paris Agreement. This is a kind of basic concept. Without transition strategy, we cannot justify this flexibility. Japan has a kind of advantageous because the government developed industry-specific roadmaps. I'm going to touch upon this roadmaps issue. This strategy should be defined in a long-term strategy, which fits Paris Agreement. This justification of the long-term strategy is coming from this sector-wide roadmap. And ICMA definitions and this climate transition-related objective is maybe quite important. But finance modality itself and this transition is not a label. Label should be a green or maybe social bonds or maybe sustainability link bonds. Green social sustainability bonds, the loan proceeds, bond proceeds should be linked with a specific object. And SLL linked bond is a certain performance condition is attached. Satisfactory performance of those targets, maybe interest rate may be a little bit lowered, or this sort of mechanism is included. So loan proceeds, bond proceeds, not directly linked with the one particular eligible item. So the two modalities possible. Common elements of those one is maybe credibility of fundraisers strategy and practice, and four element is necessary in order to. And those green bonds, loans, sustainability link bonds, its requirement is coming from standard green bonds requirement and the SLL requirements. Like green bonds, use of fund selection criteria, funds management, reporting, those should be included. That is indispensable. And SLL cases, key performance indicator and the performance target should be testified. And that's the sort of performance-based indicator should be an indispensable element. This transition financing, additional four elements is necessary. First one is long-term transition strategy and governance. This long-term strategy, including like technical developments and this sort of thing, should be linked with those and the long-term strategy. Like ammonium or maybe hydrogen can be used for electricity fuel, but this requires long-term efforts to develop the technology. This sort of long-term transition strategy is quite important. Second one is the alignment with the core business is quite important. It should be material elements of that company. And so phenomenal, superficial, the improvement is not sufficient. And materiality is quite important for this element. And third element is maybe it should be based upon scientific evidence. And the issuer strategy should be refined to the science-based targets and paths. This should be around fourth element. Transparency is quite important, and the investment plan should be aligned. And also that those details include that expenditure. It's not for just only business as usual. Some extraordinary effort is going to justify this sort of flexibility of financing. So those four elements should be conditions to be satisfied of this condition of the transition finance. And one case study of this one is the Kansai Electricity Power Company energy sector. And maybe starting points is those and the transition elements should be asked. Maybe composition of the energy sources, how many percentages for coal and also petroleum fires. And that should be replaced with the traditional ones. But so far, hydrogen or maybe ammonium, some new technology necessary to invent. So this sort of future commitment towards introduction of those replacement with the new technology should be including some element of R&D and research and development. And so this factor is making a differentiation for regular green bonds. And the second element is alignment with the core business. Importance of this reduction of the CO2 for in the energy sector. Maybe it's sufficient to say that 40% of the CO2 emission in Japan is coming from electricity sector. So this reduction of the CO2 in the electricity energy sector is quite important material subject for improvement of those emissions. And third element, that should be based upon science, like realistic scientific strategy is necessary. Without this sort of scientific base, it's just a fictitious and improvement. That cannot be justified of this mobilization of the finance. So this, how can we make justifications? There are many institutions providing kind of future scenario or maybe scenario analysis modalities proposed by TCFD. And one of the elements which is quite convenient is government setting up industry-wide roadmap. And this is one of the elements that the Japanese government to facilitate over this. And fourth element is those the transparency. And transparency is quite important because that should be defined to the clear strategy. And so those four elements should be testified. And target should be aligned with the Paris the agreement's target, like a scope 1, 2 should be reduced by 55% by 25 and 70% of 2030. And scope 1 to 3 should be reduced 50% by 2030. So this sort of alignment is quite important. Towards of this achievement of targets and those and the concrete step should be pinned down as a roadmap, like including technological development of the ammonia or hydrogens, or maybe nuclear power plants should be included and based upon overcoming of those technical shortage of the safety, or co-firing should be included, and also carbon capture should be included. And those elements should be included as a kind of reliable strategy, which is making a transition of the high emission sector, such as energy. So this is a basic concept of those and the transition, climate transition finance strategy. It's not a share green finance or maybe social bonds. Strategy is necessary, and with justify a kind of long-term transition strategy and science-based and beyond business as usual. Those are factors of the transition finance. Science-based target to this, like a reduction the targets of 1.5 degree target should be aligned. Individual finance should be structured as a kind of green finance or maybe SLL finance. Green finance in this case, individual items should be still eligible for green finance, and also SLL regular mechanism such as setting up to the performance target and the KPI should be included. So those annual achievement of the KPI should be testified. So financing modality should be tagged as a green, social, or maybe sustainable. But concept is transition finance. Those long-term strategy is making a difference. And now, final subject of those sovereign bonds. What is the difference from regular green bonds and also transition finance? Maybe apparently this sort of long-term goal and also including element of the technical developments, those are maybe making a difference. This green transformations, and when they are launching to this program, several elements is demobilized, like carbon pricing, and also that is including. When the carbon pricing is started, still insufficient revenue is generated. So maybe upfront finance should be financed this GX bond. That is the concept. So redemption of this GS bonds is a future revenue stream from carbon pricing. That is the basic idea. And new financing method is so-called and the transition finance, and which is linked with redemption through carbon pricing. And also that the government is advocating a very innovative Asia zero emission community, and also GX League it's a kind of forum among the company which is committed to the net zero. This sort of venture and also maybe some coordination mechanism towards research and development is one of the transition the factors. Commitment of key sectors included here, like energy mix, renewable should be 38%, and nuclear should be 22%. Ammonia, hydrogen should be making a kind of value chains, and transportation 100% EV for private cars, and those the target is included. Basic idea is 150 trillion Japanese yen. That means 1 trillion US dollars equivalent investment is necessary. But investment area is not the regular that green eligible expenditure, but also that the infrastructure development of those hydrogen distributions or maybe research activities. And those are maybe something distinct from a regular green financing. Green GX transition bonds is require this much, 20 trillion Japanese yen. This is a kind of government plan. They try to mobilize under those finance through bond issue and also equity investment, debt guarantee, all the sort of financial instrument is mobilized. And Japanese governments and they're advocating to the Asia Zero Emission Community, AZEC, and also Energy Transition Initiative. That is a kind of a forum to mobilize of those interaction with the technical development and also maybe economic supports among the countries. So those package is considered as a GX bond package. We completed already 5 assessments, including to this assessment of framework and also for individual transaction and the second party opinion provisions. Thank you.
So thank you very much, Masuda-san. So maybe we can pass it to Joy to hear her insights in the CPA and sustainable finance. Thank you, Joy.
So good afternoon, everyone. It's great to be with everyone today, even though I can't see all of your faces. So my name is Joyee. I'm associate from S&P Global Rating Sustainable Finance team. So today I will be walking you through some of my day-to-day practices in providing SPO assessments and also introduce our new climate transition assessment product. So let me just get started. Earlier this year in 2024, we have published a research article that forecasted the sustainable bond market to reach between 0.95 to up to 1.95 trillion US dollars of issuance, and that makes up around 14% of the total bond issuance in 2024. We expect the trends to continue, and then we see green bonds to continue taking up the majority of the issuances. At the same time, we also noted that in some markets, especially ASEAN, have begun to increase their presence in the sustainable bond market. Over the last year, the Asia Pac actually accounted for 1/4, that was 25% of the sustainable bond issuance, and that was actually our highest proportion ever. And within the Asia Pacific region, North Asian players such as South Korea, Japan, and China remain the big threes, and they have taken up around up to 80% of the regional issuance for the last 5 years. And within S&P Global Ratings, between July last year to February this year, we have produced up to 72 SPOs and assigned 145 project shades with a shade of green since rolling out our integrated methodology for assessing use of proceeds financing. And within our assessments, green SPOs remain the largest category by far, and that also reflects the trends of the overall sustainable bond market. And within the green shading, we have allocated dark green or medium green shades most frequently to categories such as renewable energy, clean transportation, and climate change adaptation. And we have seen a large representation of light green and medium green being allocated to green buildings and energy efficiency categories. Now, when it comes to how we determine our final shade, we have always been saying externally and internally that what the company does and what they aspire to do to align with a low carbon climate resilient future and towards meeting the Paris Agreement's goal ultimately matter. Our shade of green will assign and consider the issuer's activities and their extent of alignment with a 2050 future. So, for example, we would assign a dark green shade to reflect the expectation that the activities are well aligned with a low carbon future, versus if we have assigned orange or red, they will be to activities that we don't see as green at all. That could be, for example, conventional steelmaking company and their business as usual activities, or even fossil fuel exploitations. But in reality, assigning a shade is actually more complex and requires more thought process. And usually it would also require different angles of considerations, because we tend to not only consider the nature of the finance activities alone, and the impact to mitigate climate transition risk, but also the considerations of the asset's exposure to, for instance, physical climate risk. What are the embodied environmental issues? For instance, the activities exposures or additional impacts to biodiversity and land use impacts. The jurisdiction being where the issuer is headquartered, located, and operating. And lastly, the value chain concern. So for instance, the supply chain emissions from transportations, as well as to the end of life treatment of the product, whether or not they have considered the product circularity, for instance. And in terms of looking at transition in our SPOs, we have brought to you some project categories as examples. In clean transportation, the S&P Global Ratings team would typically see public low carbon solutions to have greater transition impacts than private fossil fuel modes. And electrified transportation would be viewed most favorably. And as for hydrogen and biofuel, we would typically be cautious around what could be, for instance, the potential feedstock. So say it would be easier for green hydrogen to receive darker shade than gray hydrogen, versus in biofuels, we would typically feel using waste-based and certified feedstock to be darker than feedstock that are based or made from food or crop inputs. And in APAC, hybrids would still be considered a transition solution, and they will probably receive a green shade, but in most cases, actually in all cases, they will receive like light shade at most. Whereas if hybrid solutions are being set up in the European region by an European issuer, then the project category itself would not even be considered green, typically because for a lot of European countries, they have already completed or close to completing their transition to fully decarbonize their electricity grid. So when it comes to climate change adaptation, these are categories that we have increasingly seen more often these days, and I personally believe that they could be increasingly more relevant to the Asia Pacific region as days or even years go by, because in APAC, the geographical location is very prone to natural disasters, for example, earthquakes or extreme climate events. Over the summer, we have seen a lot of countries being prone to landslides, flooding, or in some locations, even droughts. So having measures such as flood barriers, early warning signals, or even stormwater management would be considered essential for human survival. So in our shading methodology approach, it is actually usually easier to achieve dark to medium green for these kind of climate change adaptation projects. But again, of course, in terms of the ultimate shade of the allocation, we will discuss and weigh in whether the projects will contain other environmental impacts. So, for example, nature-based solutions will be weighed more favorably than engineered constructions simply because of the embodied emissions. Now, what we have touched upon earlier are financing activities and investments that are already considered compatible with a low carbon future. And in our case of SPO would be already considered green, but in the sustainable finance field, they can also be about financing activities or investments that are not yet compatible, but they contribute substantially to a reduction of greenhouse gas emissions. And there are in the market a lot of interpretations of what transition finance could mean. But broadly speaking, they refer to the financing of activities and investment that support the shift away from carbon-intensive operations to those that are more closely in line with a low-carbon, climate-resilient future. So in the market, we have a bit of observations. We have seen government, financial regulators who have been developing transition taxonomies, pathways, and roadmaps to accelerate transition financing. Masuda-san earlier touched upon the ICMA, who have updated a climate transition finance handbook to provide guidance for climate-themed bonds. And in APAC, the Hong Kong Monetary Authority has published the Hong Kong taxonomy, and in Singapore, they have launched a taxonomy featuring different traffic lights with, for example, amber for transition activities. And then there is also, for example, a common ground taxonomy that provides comparisons between similarities and differences between the EU taxonomy and the China's green bond taxonomies. Having said that, as of today, transition label bonds actually still account for less than 0.5% of the total use of proceeds sustainable bond issuance last year. This is actually particularly relevant for the hard-to-abate sectors because the hard-to-abate sectors, they contribute to more than 30% of the global greenhouse gas emissions. But at the same time, the products and service that they provide or deliver to human life are very essential to our day-to-day modern life. And it is a fact that we seem to not be able to survive without these sectors. So the challenges that these sectors face include, for example, technological constraints, because the markets do not have commercially viable or scalable solutions to decarbonize, or some financial barriers because they don't have the room or they face challenges to obtain sustainable financing at the first place. So we have had questions asking whether financing of activities could still happen without being labeled as transition financing. It could be, the answer is yes, but this also creates a lack of transparency regarding the environmental credibility of the investments, and that could also create uncertainty and confusion in the markets. And we believe this is part of the reason for low transition financing, as issuers and investors could be cautious about being potentially accused of overstating their green credentials or even facing allegations of participating in greenwashing. So just over 2 months ago, over the summer, we have launched the climate transition assessment that provides opinion on where a company is on its current transition journey and where we expect the company to head into the future. So climate transition assessment, I'll call it CTA, it can be applied across sectors and all starting points, including those companies that are earlier on in their transition journey. Using the same shades of green approach, we provide a shade on the company's current financial mix, and then we analyze the entity's transition plan that could include the company's metrics and targets, actions and investments, implementation and driver. And based on the likely future mix of the economic activities following the implementation of current plans, we assigned a shade for the future state. So for example, a dark green shade would reflect our expectations that an entity will not have any red or orange activities from their operations, and they have already transitioned to mainly dark green activities. But again, for dark green shade to appear across investments, revenue, they could be usually too ideal to be true in reality, and in most cases only apply for pure green place company. I have put 3 examples of what different transition activities for hard to abate sectors could imply for our shades. For example, in dark green, a company in hard to abate sectors, these might include the investment in new projects in green hydrogen production, provided that the company has demonstrated stringent protocols to manage environmental risk, including potential leakage, water usage, and the end-of-life usage of products. And then for medium green, we will typically assign to activities or investments that represent significant steps towards meeting the low carbon future. But on the other hand, they require a lot of substantial improvements as well in the long term. Say a company in the hard to abate sector, chemical sector, for example, the investment or activities could include replacing carbon-based feedstock with bio-based forestry waste-based feedstock. Even though the emissions are significantly lower using bio-based feedstock, there could be other indirect land use change risk that we would tend to use medium green to reflect. For light green, last but not least, they represent activities that are transition steps that are essential in the near term, not long term. But in the long term, they require substantial improvements that could avoid the emissions lock-in. Say, for example, a chemicals company again, it could include a new waste heat recovery facility plant, and then the source of waste heat has to be fossil fuel based because at the moment there is limited market alternative. But the facility plant has demonstrated that it could be compatible with lower emission sources when those lower emission sources become readily available in the market. So we would typically assign light green to this kind of activities because on one hand, they allow the reuse of energy that would otherwise be unused. But on the other hand, we would typically flag the emissions lock-in because of the fossil fuel-based situation. So to illustrate how we may feel or differentiate between non-green shades, meaning yellow, orange, or red, let me just take chemical sector as an example again. So if activities or investments are associated with conventional fertilizers, we would usually assign yellow to reflect the significant emissions. But on the other hand, fertilizers could improve crop yields and allow more efficient use of land. For orange shade, it would be, for example, activities or investment with a traditional petrochemicals facility that do not have room or little use of renewable inputs. And lastly, for red shade, usually there is no room for argument for red shade. It would be typically the ongoing refining of oil and gas or exploitation of oil and gas. When we perform a CTA, we would try to understand the entity's climate transition plan. So there are some key questions that we tend to ask the company. For example, what is the transition plan? What is the target? What is your timeline? what are the investment actions that the company has, and they will promise and they will commit to. And when will they start executing the strategy or action plans? And by when do they expect these kind of activities or investments to deliver changes? Apart from investments or strategy or action plans, we will also be trying to understand the governance structure. So for example, in terms of climate transition planning and implementation, how is the overall oversight structure of the company? The quality of progress reporting, for example, the target achievement, how often do they evaluate or readjust the targets based on the level of achievement of the targets? And lastly, we will also be trying to understand the external factors, such as, for instance, any geographical or regulation factors that could encourage or discourage their ability to implement actions. So I'm actually very happy to share that we have recently published 2 CTA reports. Both of the CTA reports are based in Europe. We had one on the right-hand side that is from a real estate company based in Switzerland, and then another one who is a pure play EV charging equipment company based in Finland. So for anyone who is interested in our CTA products, I would encourage you all to go check out those public reports. In the public reports, you will be able to look at the shading rationale, for instance, the current activities, investments, and also the future shade. So we would also be providing qualitative elaborations on the metrics and targets, investment actions, and also implementation drivers. This marks the end of my presentation. Thank you. And so I'll now pass it back to you, Andy, for Q&A.
Okay. Thank you very much, Joyee. It's quite insightful presentation. So I think, we have received quite a few questions. We would like to seek the insight and experience from our very experienced speakers. The first one is the question to Joyee. You talk about, some of the hard to abate sectors and their, dark, medium, light green assessment. Can you share with us, is there any APAC examples of SPO or CTAs from the hard to abate sector that you can share with us? We can have a more insight regarding these examples. Thank you.
Sure. Thanks, Andy, for the questions. So unfortunately for CTAs, we do not have any public example that we could share at the moment for Asia Pacific region. Those examples about the Switzerland and as well as Finland issuers, they're available online. For SPOs, I recalled completing a China-based SPO for an issuer that is headquartered in Henan province. And the company is based in China and they are operating in the aviation business. So for the company, they have been investing in purchasing sustainable aviation fuel to be used in their cargo planes. And the SAF, sustainable aviation fuel, will be made from biomass waste. And for the company within the renewable energy projects, they have included life cycle emission threshold being set in accordance to the EU guidelines. But at the end, we have actually assigned light green shade because of the hard to abate nature of the renewable energy product of SAFs because of the carbon lock-in risk. For SAFs, at the moment, the transition nature of the project, they can only be used as a blending mix with conventional fossil fuel-based aviation fuel. So we have seen limited market alternatives in general. So light green shade has been given to the SPOs.
Okay, thank you very much, Joyee. Then Masuda-san, we have a question for the Japanese sustainable finance. Can you provide with us how the banking sector can work in the sustainable finance, like policies, activities, etc.? it must also include the impact and the profit, right? So let's hear your opinion. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much for these questions. And I think the bank industry is quite the central driving force of the transition financing. Traditional green finance is addressing to those and maybe solar panel, wind generations, those typical ones. But that how can they deal with those high emission sector? That is maybe main challenge for attaining to the net zero society. So maybe as I mentioned, and the ICMA standards set up certain the points to be a qualification as a transition finance. One is those strategy elements, and the second one is maybe the justifications. Those are efforts beyond business as usual, and should be verified as a scientific based and strategy. Those sort of credible strategies should be helped by somebody. So from a financing arrangement perspective, this sort of elements should be supported by those consulting advisory to the banks. In Japan, there is some transition financing task force is formulated by the Ministry of Industry and Trade, METI, and a series of banks is participating in this task force to formulate standardizations. And particularly for this, the industry-wide mapping is a quite good guidance. In Japanese evaluation system is not using kind of three color signal or maybe six color signal. We are just checking to the satisfy or not satisfy of those standards set by ICMA. That is the main focus. And the banking sector can crucial to formulate of this sort of justifiable strategy to be financed under the transition finance.
Thank you very much, Masuda-san. This is very helpful. The next one is also related to the Japanese one. So we would like to hear your insights. What are the initiatives taken by the Japanese governments, particularly for sustainable finance activities initiatives of other countries in Asian region? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. And particularly recently that the Japanese mega bank is quite active in the foreign activities and their profits, 40% is earning from foreign countries. So that maybe those supply chain issue is quite crucial for Japanese the companies to develop in regional or economic development. So from that angle, that the government is supported various elements from those activities. One is maybe Japanese government providing some subsidy program regarding to those technical developments, and also maybe some of the second party opinions, formulation of those sustainable financing. Government support is available. And also that the governmental financial agencies like JBIC and NEXI is providing to this concept of the transition financing in order to facilitate this transition and the investments, and also that the resource mobilization towards to R&D, which is quite important to realize of this transition finance. So that the full-fledged scope is quite wide, and the Japanese government is try to capture this opportunity as a kind of opportunity to transformation of the industry itself. That's the reason why that the Japanese government is quite adamant to support of those activities.
Okay, thank you, Masuda-san. Then I would like to check with Joyee for one question from investors. Aside from reporting, monitoring and evaluation of achievements of targets, what are other governance aspects do you look for when you assess the initiative addressing climate and transition risks?
Sure, Andy. Let me take that. So in addition to, for example, reporting and monitoring, in terms of implementation drivers, we would tend to look at the organization alignment. So for example, does the company have the right leadership structure, say a sustainability committee or any working groups that has demonstrated clear commitment and accountability in the past to achieve the targets? And then in terms of financial management as well, is the cost of the plan being consistent with the company's balance sheet or in the future as well? And then there could be some considerations to hurdles as well. So for instance, we would be checking what could be the potential risk to impact the success of achieving the target, including, for example, any opposition from their major stakeholders. What are the considerations of new technology reliance, such as whether or not those new technology could actually materialize or be available in the future, or even, as I've said, the regulations and government policy of different regional variations. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Joy. The next one, I would like to check with Masuda-san. Have the Japanese government provided any incentives to financial institutions to promote sustainable finance and transition finance? Let's hear your insight. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much for this one. To my knowledge, the direct interest subsidy is not available, but only the supports is maybe those expenses related to the second party opinion is also that are provided, and also that some model case and the government supports to those innovative front runners cases. They are also supporting to those evaluation expenses. And those are maybe that the government is supported in the Ministry of Environment, MITI, or maybe for regional governments, and the Tokyo Metropolitan Government is supporting some aspect of those and the sustainable financing. And so that is maybe to my knowledge.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much, Masuda-san. Then can I check one question to Joy? When you do the CTA assessment, do you have any specific weighting when you do this kind of assessment? If yes, what's the roughly guidance we can know about that? Thank you.
Thank you, Andy. So yes, in terms of CTA, we will provide the shading based on the weighting on the economic activities of the company. So the shade would be based on the shades of green approach, dark green, medium green, light green to non-green, such as yellow, orange, or red. And the weighting will be based on the latest reported revenues and investments for non-financial companies. And then for financial institutions, some financial metrics that we will rely on would be investments, lending, or their underwriting exposures. So this kind of information, we would usually be looking at the company's annual report or the sustainability report to adjust the weighting. And the future shade will be based on as I've said, the transition plan of the company. So the metrics and targets, implementation drivers, as well as the action plan as well. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Then it's a very similar one. There's somebody also, an investor, also quite interested about the CTA assessment you have. So can you share with us? Do you convene like a committee to assign your CTA, or how you do that? Thank you.
Yeah. Thanks, Andy, again for your questions. So for CTA, it will be similar to our approach to SPO. For each completion or finalization of the draft SPO or CTA report, we will have a committee or a steering that we call that will usually have a mix-up of global voters in the sustainable finance team, and then the majority of the outcome will determine the overall shading or the weighting of the SPO or the CTA results. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Joyee. Then we have the last questions for Masuda-san. Do you think, is there any like conflict of interest? Because when you do like assign ratings, but at the same time you also assign the CTA, would it be a conflict that some of this assessment with the same team head, same composition, etc.? How you avoid like conflict of interest for this subject? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much for these questions. And to my practice and to our practice and entirely different the team is assigned. And also that the decision-making points is totally separated. So from that angle, that the issue to address is totally separate. Creditworthiness and also maybe satisfaction of those and the standards. Maybe different sets answers. So maybe team should be separated and also that the decision making is separated. But nevertheless, understanding of corporates is quite an important basis of making kind of assessment because as I explained, those reliable strategies quite important. And this strategy should be based upon current business practice. And so the corporate business practice will be defined in terms of those and the future strategy elements. So good expertise as a credit rating agency will be quite beneficial to making a kind of fair assessment of sustainable finance. And also today's non-financial disclosure requirements is legalized. So maybe that the financial disclosure should include some of the elements to making assessment. And so from that angle, that the full knowledge of ESG is required for credit rating analysts. So in that sense, and maybe a credit rating should be quite good supplement to the sustainable judgment. And also that sustainable elements is quite important to those and the future creditworthiness. So this area is now overlapping.
Thank you, Masuda-san. That's quite helpful and quite comforting to us. The next questions, Joyee, we would like to seek your opinion. Do you think the climate transition assessment can help to validate the 2050 net zero target? What's your view?
Thanks, Andy, for your question again. I think it is important to stress that CTA is forming our qualitative opinion of how consistent an entity's current economics activities are with a low carbon future. So we do not necessarily encourage company to take the assessment as an assurance report, but an rather independent view on whether we see a credible investment plan and implementation strategy to realize the target. Say, for example, if a company has announced a net zero target by 2050, but from what we understood from their investment plan and strategy, they have disclosed or shared with us, they actually seem to cover up only to 2030. So then the future shade that we will assign to the company will only be up to 2030 of the future state of shade to reflect our view of the credibility of their plan. So no, I would not encourage company to use the CTA as an assurance report of their net zero target. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Joy. Appreciate the clarification. We have the next questions to Masuda-san. Based on your knowledge and experience, do you see like any physical or regulatory incentive offered to the financial institution sector in Japan for this kind of sustainable finance? Thank you.
Yeah, you are aware that just recently that IOSCO is a certain policy papers. They did a survey to market practice, and they found that some of the market practice require kind of enhancement of those disciplines, and maybe some of the principles applied to the credit rating can be effective. And in Japan, and Financial Service Agency drafted code of conduct, and the voluntary acceptance of this code of conduct is a kind of modality of those and the regulations. We don't apply to the license requirement to the ESG assessment. We understand in Europe, the license requirement is introduced. And to my knowledge, in Asia, India authority is introduced this license requirement for ESG assessments. And so maybe the world current is towards to those introduction of the license requirements. But so far, license or not, then maybe most important element is how do we provide over those credible, useful information for investor decisions. That point should be maybe very important. And still, that the market is a way to formulate. So useful assessments will be scrutinized by the eye of investors and eye of lenders. So from that angle, that maybe service content will be subject to the kind of market scrutiny. And so from this angle, maybe that the fake or maybe misinformation is something that should be penalized with the regulatory environments. But more than that, how can we provide useful information for useful reference to the investor or lenders? That sort of consolidation is going on without kind of applying to the regulatory penalty. So this sort of market consideration consolidation is still going on and will continue for at least next 5 years.
Thank you very much, Masuda-san. The last questions for you. We'd like to see how capacity development efforts were carried out in Japan with regards to the area of sustainable financing in overall term, given the fact that a lot of stakeholders to be educated and made aware of this. Who took the leadership in the area of capacity building in sustainable finance? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. This is also very interesting and important questions. Particularly those and the sustainable financing concept is a private financing is quite important. And also that the government tried to divert certain resource to the certain desirable area, but not the way of the regulations. Maybe voluntary the direction to the private activity is quite important. So from that angle, I think the capacity building, not like to the ODA or official financing developments, and those in the financing area, private activity is quite important. So that many consulting firms try to develop their own the methodologies and their own services. And I think those and the service also subject to the kind of market scrutiny. And so this the try and error to develop useful, reliable, kind of efficient market is going to formulate. I think right now it's the directions and everybody talking about this risk of those and the greenwashing. This sort of the element is already there. But the important element is unlike MDG, SDG is quite the ESG or element is quite private-driven initiative. So that element is maybe private, spontaneous, the efforts to the capacity development is important. So from that angle, that the international standards is coming from some of the very limited number of providers like ICMA or maybe the Climate Bond Initiative, CBI or something like that. But from now on, individual countries' standards is going to set up based upon consultation of the individual countries' financial forum. So I think the forum like ABA is quite critical to formulate of this sort of local practice and local standards. That's my observation.
Thank you very much, Masuda-san, and thank you, Joy, for your insights. We have learned a lot, and of course, thank you, investor, for your participation and interest. We look forward to hear from you if you have any feedback, and we will send over the replay link. We're looking forward to see you again in the next webinar hosted by ABA and ACRAA in the near future. Thank you. Have a nice day and goodbye.